And I want to shake people and say, no, this is not your great-grandfather's PKD. Yeah, I never kind of woke up and thought to myself, oh, I have to do this again. Why did I sign up for this? And I think part of that was actually a couple of parts. One, the mission, the reason for doing this was so compelling to me that I always was able to keep the goal, the bigger picture in mind. So it wasn't like I was doing this for myself and it was like, well, who cares? And I won't ride today. It was this big, really 4 objectives of the ride, right? It was raising money for the research. It was building community. It was raising awareness, and it was advocating for our legislative priorities. And those are all kind of big, meaty objectives. And keeping those in mind every morning, when that alarm went off at 5:30 for me to get ready for the day, it was like, okay, let's get going today. There's writing to be done, but also work to be done along the way. And then the other really important part, which was a complete surprise to me, is how much inspiration I personally pulled from all of the meetings that we had in the field. So if I was simply riding my bike across the country, yeah, okay, right, who's going to know? But because we had, I think, more than 30 meetings with both patients afflicted with PKD, and sometimes in groups, sometimes individually, and research universities. When I had these meetings, I became so inspired, so motivated to work on behalf of all these people I was meeting in the field. When you're alone and you have a disease, you're always stuck in your own thoughts. When you get out there and you recognize the power of the community that's working, not just on my behalf, but on behalf of the whole community, how many people are in need, what some of their very inspirational stories are, how researchers are so committed to the cause, you can't help but be inspired by it. And I really was. So as I said, every day, whether there were a couple of physical nicks and cuts and bruises and muscle fatigue, or whether it was mental fatigue, I never let that get in the way, because the bigger picture was just that much bigger. There were a lot of favorite moments, and I won't bore you with all of them, but they probably get categorized. So I just mentioned kind of the university visits and meeting with the researchers. And of course, I wouldn't pick out any individual university, but they all kind of rolled out the red carpet. And they rolled it out not just for me and Beth, and sometimes we had family members and friends with us, but also for the community to talk about the status of research, the status of clinical trials, where the money goes when they get either grants from the foundation or from government institutions. And really, it was really interesting to find out, by the way, that more than 90% of the researchers I met with chose to do research in PKD, as opposed to PKD choosing them. That is, if you've got a family history of PKD, or if you have it yourself, you could see that the kind of logical connection and motivation to do work in PKD. But the large majority of researchers don't have PKD or a family history of it. They just find it to be a really interesting and obviously life-altering disease that needs lots of research. And so to me, that was really cool. And also talking to them about becoming centers of excellence, the great practices that they have, that they share with others. And I'll just leave you with one other thought on researchers. This is, to me, the first time in my entire career. I'm 60 years old. I ran businesses in industry for 40 years. And I know that most companies in industry are competitors, and when they develop something or they innovate something, they hold that innovation very close to the vest, right? They kind of put patents around it, intellectual property, trade secrets. They kind of hold it just to, that's the way you make money, is by protecting your competitive advantage. In PKD in particular, I'm so delighted by the fact that the researchers across the country all collaborate with one another. They know one another. They've been in the field, for many of them, for 3 or 4 decades, particularly the folks at KUMC, where Grantham set up the center there 40 years ago. And a lot of those researchers studied under Grantham, which is, so cool to connect it to the history of PKD. But the fact that they all know one another, they were in Lisbon together in July, they share notes, they build on one another's research, they share animal models, means that it's not individual universities working on PKD, it's the whole community of universities. Now, of course, they all have their area of specialization, but there really was a sense that they collaborate, they like one another, they're friends, and that they're advancing their own research based on the research done in other places. So that's certainly a favorite top memory for me, is the university research. The second category is meeting new donors. I started with a list of, whatever, I think it was like 6,000 names in an email database. But the interesting part is that more than half of the donors, and we have about 1,000 donors who gave to the ride, were people who were not on that original list. And we met either physically or virtually new donors all along the way. And they inspired me with their stories. Hey, I heard about your ride. I want to support you. Hey, my family's got PKD. Thank you for doing this. Here's a show of support. Which was incredible, right? It was like the power of the network. You tell one person and they tell their network, or you go on one newscast and somebody sees it and they feel compelled to get in touch and support. And I just two quick stories, and I apologize if I told you these two already, but there were two people in particular I met on the road who really inspired me. One, I had just come out of the Grand Canyon, beautiful, beautiful riding in the Grand Canyon, by the way. And I was in Navajo Nation, which is not a very prosperous place. People have had hard lives in Navajo Nation. And I was at a picnic table after the ride, just collecting my thoughts. And a 12-year-old boy named Lincoln came and sat at the table, brought over a bag of chips and a soda. And he said, "Hey, mister, what are you doing?" And I told him, about the ride for PKD and the fact that I had it. And he said, "Well, why don't you just take a pill for it?" I said, "Yeah, there's no treatment, no cures for the disease." And he said, "Well, why are you riding?" And I said, "Well, to raise money to support research." And he got very pensive for about a minute and a half. He was kind of just looking down at his chips. And 90 seconds into that, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out 5 crumpled $1 bills, his only money. And he put it on the table and he pushed it across and he said, "Mister, I want you to have this for your research fund." And to me, it just struck me as, here's someone who's probably doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't come from money. It was probably the only $5 he had. He was 12 years old. So where do you get that kind of generosity of spirit and charitable giving? Clearly he was raised the right way, but he wanted us to have the money to support the cause. And that was just a tremendous show of charitable giving and caring, which is really cool. And the other couple I met were Justin and Emily Strauss. I met them at USC. I had not known them before. They had been connected with us through a public relations firm. They gave birth in early 2020 to an infant young boy who, until the last month that he was in gestation, they didn't know he had ARPKD. They didn't know they were both carriers. And so they gave birth to Austin, who unfortunately died 37 days after he was born. Just a tragic story. But it is a story about PKD, right? That so many of us have it and don't know it. We're carriers, or, we get diagnosed with it. We never heard of it before. And that was the Strausses. They never heard of it before. But they got very much committed to supporting the cause, but didn't know how. And they had heard about the ride. They knew we were in Southern California. They also live in Southern California. They said, "Hey, we'd like to meet you at USC, hear a little bit about the research and meet you." And that started a terrific partnership. Turns out that Emily is a very accomplished jeweler. Her EF collection is very popular. And she said, I want to support you. And so Justin and Emily made a very generous donation to the ride. And in addition to that, they raffled off one of her beautiful diamond necklaces, sold $25 raffle tickets for a $6,000 necklace, and raised more than $35,000 in addition to their very generous donation to begin with, directly to the PKD Foundation to support research. And just amazing to meet new donors like that, both the small donors like Lincoln and the big donors like the Strausses, and know that we're kind of building support and building community one person at a time. So donors was definitely a highlight to me, for sure. I just go on just a couple other categories. A third category of highlights is really the riding itself. And listen, there were days in the saddle where, you know, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. They were boring days, hot, humid, headwinds. You think, ugh, riding a bike is terrible. But those were the minority of the days. The majority of the days were really interesting, fun riding, challenging riding, and then just some of the most spectacular scenery. You know, seeing the country at 70 miles an hour in a car, you know, it can be fun. You cover a lot of ground, but things pass by in a blink. When you're on a bike at 16 or 17 miles an hour, you can kind of take it in. You still see 60 miles of countryside in a day, but at a slow enough pace where you could smell the countryside, you could kind of recognize the sights, you can pull over and stop to see, you know, horses galloping in a field, or, you know, a beautiful vista. So, you know, the Pacific Coast Highway, the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon in Utah, the hills outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just beautiful riding. Riding in northern Connecticut, riding with supporters in California, and Colorado, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. People came out to ride with us. Just incredible. So the riding, there were some really, really high points where I just thought, wow, this country is just filled with natural beauty. And then I'll say just one more category, maybe two more. The meetings we had in the field with chapters in places like Cincinnati and Kansas City and Columbus and Pittsburgh and Massachusetts, where we got a chance to connect with other PKD sufferers and talk about how we deal with PKD and what our stories are, was just so rich, so inspiring to me, and hopefully to them as well, to know that we're not alone. And that is the big part about PKD, is when you're diagnosed, you feel very much alone. So to build the community and know that we have a support network, and to curate that support network, was a big highlight for me. And of course, we had parties along the way where we had friends and family supporting the efforts. The big one in Central Park, or the Finish Line Party in Boston. We had kickoff parties in Vail and in California, parties in Colorado. So to get the community together to help support. And I'll just finish with this. So I said we had these four main priorities, and I had no idea when we first started what kind of challenges there would be, nor what level of success we might have against all four of them. So, yeah, obviously we're very proud of building the community, being able to touch people all across the country and connect them to one another so they can help one another. It was about building awareness, and I did 22 television, radio, or print interviews. And that went out into communities who, you know, never heard of PKD. And I got a lot of feedback. People said, hey, I saw the newscast and I'm making a donation, or, you know, I saw the newscast, my brother-in-law has PKD. I never knew there was anybody else out there who had it, and they connected. So we clearly built awareness of the disease, which we all know is needed. So, you know, check the box on that. We feel good about that. The legislative priorities around additional funding from the government and around supporting the Living Donor Protection Act. You know, one very important example of that, it was in Kansas City, right? Sharice Davids came out, and the value of that meeting, it was very nice of her to come out, by the way, but if you'll remember, she said, hey, how can I support you? And we said, well, now that you asked, you know, we'd love to have your support on the Living Donor Protection Act. And she hadn't really heard of it. And she went back to her office that afternoon, reviewed it, and then sent an email the next morning saying, I want you to know I've signed on to be a co-sponsor of the Living Donor Protection Act. That is a phenomenal, if that was the only result of the ride, it would have been worth it. So that was really phenomenal. So we feel good about getting out there and supporting our legislative priorities. And then, you know, last but certainly not least is the fundraising goal. We set out to raise 500,000. I'm happy to report, as of this morning, we're over 600,000. So
that's great.
I'm very confident that we'll get to 640,000, which is our revised goal, by the first week in October. And so, that is hopefully a way to ignite some additional research, because this is a game, so to speak, of money, right? There are researchers out there with great ideas, but they can't always get funding for them. And what we need, because we don't know what idea is going to ultimately lead to some advancement in developing treatments and or the cure, we need to support lots and lots of research that come from lots and lots of brilliant minds across the country. And so, feel really good about, doing our small part to help bring that kind of funding to the foundation, so that Chris Rusconi and Elise Hoover and the team of researchers can make decisions about the best ways to invest that money and deploy it. So yeah, listen, I told you we're on the road for 20 weeks, lots of highlights, but those would be kind of categories and examples of some of the best highlights. I'll give you kind of my unvarnished take on the communities that we met. The foundation has a small group of some very dedicated ambassadors. And if you talk to anyone in the foundation, which chapters, like I was in Denver yesterday, there were, 100+ people there for the walk. But I know there are some communities where 2 people show up for the walk, right? So, but we're lucky to have the very dedicated ambassadors that we do have. I would tell you one of the opportunities I see related to that is I think the foundation could use more centralized support, maybe even a core dedicated person at headquarters to support the local chapters across the country, to share best practices. Hey, why is Kansas City or New York so successful at bringing in new members where some others seem to not be getting anywhere? There are best practices out there to be shared, to be managed, and I think there's an opportunity there. But we are lucky to have the dedicated ambassadors that we do. I learned, and I probably knew it, but in hearing the stories, how varied our disease is. Again, the Strausses lost their son Austin at 37 days of age. I met teenagers on dialysis, young adults in their 20s who've had not 1 but 2 kidney transplants. Also people in their 70s who are hanging on to their kidneys that still have some kidney function, and everything in between. And so PKD is not one disease. Hey, it affects you at this age, and your kidneys fail at that age. And some people have polycystic liver disease, some people have aneurysms, some people have kidney stones. It's a very varied disease. So that kind of strikes you as, there is no one case or one way that the disease progresses. One thing we all are looking for is hope. There are many in the community who are hopeless, so hopeless that they don't get involved in any kind of proactive care for themselves, and which I find quite frankly frustrating. I just want to shake people and say, no, just, get involved. But people are looking for hope. And I think one of the things we perhaps were able to provide was hope from communicating the status of research in the field and advances in clinical trials and drugs that are in development, to say to people, hey, yeah, there's a lot of things going on out there. Don't lose hope. Buy yourself time, give the researchers time, and hopefully you can push off the decline of your kidney function, so that we give these researchers time to come up with effective treatments. I was also surprised that so many of the people I met with were already post-transplant. Probably more than half the PKD patients I met were post-transplant. I didn't realize how prevalent it was in our community. And perhaps, people who are post-transplant because they now have hope. They see themselves kind of being over the hump of the disease, are more willing to put themselves out there, to be actively engaged, to say, hey, my good fortune of being cured by getting a new kidney gives me a new lease on life, and I want to help the community. Where people who are still suffering from the disease and are pre-transplant maybe aren't as focused on the community. They're more focused on, hey, I got to take care of myself, and I don't have time to, get involved in a broader community. But I was kind of intrigued by that demographic. A lot of post-transplant spouses and caretakers are so vitally important in our community. And so often the people who are most involved have a very supportive spouse. Some spouses, by the way, have given their kidneys to the PKD sufferer, which is an amazing stories, like half a dozen of those stories over the 20 weeks around the road. But many are just there. They get involved in the disease. They get involved in the foundation. They take care of the spouse that has PKD. So that's very inspirational as well, that people who have great supportive spouses aren't going through this journey alone. So those, I would say, are some of the positives. I think some of the, let's call them opportunities for improvement, not problems, but opportunities. There are so many people in our community who are reluctant to get involved in an active way in their own health or in the health of the community. And again, to me, I'm just very grateful for everything that happened during the ride. But if I was frustrated by one thing, it's the fact that there are so many people in our community who are burying their heads in the sand, simply waiting for their kidneys to fail. And I don't know how to understand it, without doing sort of more, discussions with people like that. But I think what it comes down to is, because PKD is so prevalent in families, hey, my mother had it, my grandfather had it, my great grandmother had it, that the old way of thinking about PKD was, hey, there's nothing you can do. There's no treatment, no cure. So all we have to do is wait for our kidneys to fail, go on dialysis, get on a transplant list, and hopefully get a transplant before we die. So there's nothing you can do. So people who grow up in households like that, with that kind of mentality, say, why should I be actively involved? I'm just going to need a kidney transplant one day. I'll just wait for that. And I want to shake people and say, no, this is not your great grandfather's PKD. This is today's PKD, where there are lifestyle interventions. There are nephrologists who can help you feel better along the journey, who can perhaps slow down the growth rate of your cysts. There are nutritional changes you can make to feel better and hopefully maintain your kidney function. There are diagnostic tests you can do. There are clinical trials you can get involved in. Don't sit on your couch. Don't bury your head in the sand. Get actively involved. But there's so many in our community who either don't get that message, or they hear it, but they don't understand it. And so I think there's a real opportunity to get more people more actively involved. And lastly, I'd say, and we know this, but it struck me while I was in the field, this is, if we think about this as a disease that impacts 600,000 individuals, they're just going to spread across the country. It seems like a more daunting challenge to attack than if we think of it as maybe 100,000 families with an average of 6 PKD patients in each family. I don't know that those numbers are even close to being right, but that's how it strikes me is, there's such a because it's genetically inherited, there's such a tight family connection that we're not talking about 600,000 families. We're probably talking about 100,000 families. I think a couple of lessons learned. For one thing from the riding perspective. So when I first kind of hatched the idea for the ride, I knew I wanted to do it as a cross-country ride to get to as many of the chapters as I could, as you see on the list behind me. There's obviously no way to get there except to go, west to east and matriculate your way across the country. But I was also hoping that there'd be more riders. Most of the days, probably 80 of the 100 days, I rode alone. There's some advantages to that, but it's also quite lonely to be on a bike for 4 or 5 hours a day, just kind of stuck in your own head, thinking your own thoughts, without there being anybody to talk to or share the journey with. Of course, Beth was there every morning and every evening, but along the road, it was just me. So I think one of the things to encourage more riders, if and when we do this again, is to do kind of circular routes in cities to get people to join for a day or two before moving on to the next city, so that we have more both residence time in a city, but also give people the full loop, so they can show up in the morning, get on their bikes, and at the end of the day, back at their car at the end of the day, so they can drive home. And then we can move on to the next city. So that's probably one thing. In terms of the planning, the execution, the logistics, the way that we did it in the RV, the fundraising, sponsorships. I feel, listen, nothing was perfect, but I feel pretty good about the way that we did it. In terms of how the ride went compared to my expectations, physically, the ride was easier, not easy, but easier than I thought it was going to be. Maybe because of the inspiration we talked about, every morning saying I've got a bigger purpose here. So it isn't just riding my bike, it's supporting the community. But I found the physical side of it to be manageable. But I found the mental side of it to be much tougher. And it's tough to be on a bike for 5 hours a day. There's all kinds of hazards when you're on a bike, right? The road surface, there's pieces of wood and rocks and gravel and dirt and missing pieces of road, and you got motorists coming at you, motorists from behind you, and other cyclists and pedestrians, and it's every second of the ride there's an opportunity for you to fall down or get hit. And so I didn't expect this, but kind of there's a mental tension all along the journey. And so when I got back to the RV at the end of every day, I was mentally spent. My brain turned to mush by the end of July. I had like nothing left. So mentally, it was much tougher than I thought it was going to be, but physically a little bit more manageable. I found out fundraising was the first time I've ever raised funds. I remember Susan DeRemer, when I talked to her, let's say 18 months ago, and I said, "Hey, Susan, I'm going to ride my bike across the country and raise $500,000 for the PKD Foundation." She said, "From who?" $500,000, that's outrageous. You're never going to be able to do that. She didn't say you'd never be able to do that, but that was implied in her comments. You know how tough that is? Like, I don't, but maybe because I don't know how tough it is, I'm going to set the goal high. And by setting the goal high, it encourages to just keep on pushing, right? If we set the goal for 100,000, it would have been a very different communication. We wouldn't have managed it the way that we did, but $500,000, but it was tough, right? 90% of even friends and family who see the emails or see the appeals either say, "Hey, it's not my cause," or "I'll get to it later," or it's just repeat messaging and repeat asking and trying to find the right way to compel people to donate. Man, is it hard. So that's a constant uphill battle. Perseverance and continuous messaging, that's what's required to be successful in fundraising. And there was I never had one day where I wasn't thinking about or acting on fundraising. So that was tough. The logistics were challenging, listen, going from RV campground to campground to campground, to tie that into my riding, to get the RV set up and torn down every day, driving a 50-foot train, it's 35-foot RV and then a 15-foot vehicle. And, Beth did an incredible job, but those logistics are tough. So we're happy we did it because we kind of get to sleep in our own bed every night and cook our own meals. We weren't staying in, flea bag motels and worried about bed bugs and uncomfortable beds and stuff like that. But it's a challenging way to sort of uproot every day and then reset and do the same for 120 days. And the last thing I'll say is the loneliness on the road was more than I anticipated it would be. Because again, I rode alone most of the time, and there were some days where there was nothing. There was a day in Utah, I got on the road, and the first sign I saw was "no services next 128 miles." And by no services, they mean no services. There's not a cell signal, a gas station, a convenience store, a source of water, no services, nothing. And you hardly saw another car, much less another person, for hours and hours. It's a very lonely feeling. It makes you feel very small. So the loneliness was a little bit more than I expected it would be. But again, the motivation of just thinking, hey, you're doing this for the right cause, just helped me get through that. So yeah, those are kind of some of the differences to maybe what I expected. I presented to the New York City chapter of the foundation back in April before the ride started. I did about a half hour, and then we opened the floor for Q&A, and I was on a Zoom just like this. And so as the floor opened for questions, and I was in the room by myself when I made the presentation, my wife Beth walked into the room. And the first question that was asked that she heard was, "So Glenn, you seem to have some momentum in this even before the ride starts. Are you going to do this every year?" And Beth put her head right over my shoulder, looked into the camera and said, "No friggin' way." So yeah, she knew how complex it was even before we started the journey, and then it just got more complex and more challenging. So the Ride for PKD cross country won't be an annual event, but this idea of doing local rides, um, even next summer, right, to maybe pick 5 or 10 cities and do a weekend ride in each and then move on to the next city, I think is an idea with some legs. There's a ride called RAGBRAI. RAGBRAI it's a party for cyclists in the state of Iowa. The BRAI part is the bike ride across Iowa, RAGBRAI. It's the last week of July every year, and it rides the length of or the width of Iowa, about 450 miles and lots of climbing. But 15, 20, 25,000 people show up to ride, just a moving party. But it would be fun to take a team of Ride for PKD cyclists to the RAGBRAI and ride across Iowa in July as kind of a 1-week event versus a 20-week event. So there could be something like that. We might do ski for PKD. We live in Vail, so we're skiing all the time. So there could be something like that. So we're definitely starting to brainstorm a little bit about what's next and why do this. I'm on the Advocacy Champions Network, so I'll continue to be on the ACN and continue to advocate for our legislative priorities. I think, doing the ride and having a little bit of notoriety through all the interviews maybe helps me get in front of Congress people a little bit easier than I otherwise would have. So we'll continue to do that. I'll continue to be on the research grant committee, working with Chris Rusconi and Elise Hoover on where the funding goes, providing my opinion on it for what it's worth. I certainly learned a lot about the biology and the genetics of PKD, so I have a better context to put the research grant proposals within. I'll stay very active with the foundation. I've made a lot of great friends. I mean, Sue Full was, incredible. Danielle Rose, Kristen Kuckelman, Carmen Gleason, Chris Rusconi, Elise, yourself. I mean, just developing these relationships and knowing how good and committed all of you are to helping our community. How can I not help you help us? Which is really my message to the whole community, right? We have to support the foundation in helping us treat and cure this disease. So I'll continue to be very actively involved with deeper connections to the management and the leadership of the foundation. So we're going to keep this going. We've got good momentum. We really enjoyed it. I would characterize it as, beyond having children, getting married and having children, it's the most meaningful thing I've ever done in my life. I've had a lot of great business successes and great personal successes, but nothing has been as meaningful as a Ride for PKD. And so that's how I genuinely feel about it. And so it'll keep me actively engaged in finding other ways to support the foundation. Well, so and I think the foundation does a lot of it. It's probably about doing more of what's already been successful. So we know nephrologists in the first line of offense, if you will, right? Somebody shows up and says, "Hey, I got flank pain," or my father had PKD, I think I might have it as well. How do those physicians, nephrologists, talk to their patients about actively engaging? How do they give them hope? And I know most nephrologists are probably very good at what they do, but I definitely met some who were like, "Hey, here's my approach." Terry Watnick at University of Maryland is a perfect example. She gets very actively engaged with her patient population and their families, and heavily promotes signing up for the foundation registry. And I think she has a registry herself as well, getting involved in clinical trials, making lifestyle changes, thinking about the disease as being a manageable one versus an unmanageable one. And if she does it successfully, it means that every nephrologist could, if they're motivated and educated to do so. So I think that's an important part. Can't just leave it up to the patient population to say, "Okay, I'll, just unilaterally, I'll get more actively involved." I think they need information and a push. Hey, connect with your local chapter, find out some more information about the foundation and resources available. I think once we know there are people out there, and obviously we have to be very careful about patient-doctor confidentiality, but yeah, I think there's a way to promote active engagement to members of the community. And it's just so important for people to recognize if I've got the disease and I'm not actively engaged in clinical trials and in the registry, I'm not helping myself or our community come up with treatments or a cure. This disease is too complicated. It's not someone else's disease. If you've got it, you can't be selfish and hold it to yourself. You have to be magnanimous and helpful to the community and get involved. I think that's the messaging. My overwhelming emotion. And by the way, I'm still a little bit conflicted about how I feel about the end of the ride. It's quite bittersweet because, if you do something for 20 straight weeks and then it ends, you're like, oh no, I don't want it to end. Yeah, I needed to get off the road for sure, and I need to recharge my batteries, but I feel, like I wanted it to keep going. It was just such an incredible experience. But the overwhelming emotion I feel is gratitude. I obviously this was not about me. This is about other people supporting the cause, hearing a message and jumping on board. Sometimes the first time they heard the message, or proactively, sometimes the 20th time they heard the message, but people getting involved to support. So obviously we have 1,000 donors and sponsors who supported the ride financially. Major kudos to them. I told you most of those people, more than half of those people, I didn't know before I started the ride. So, we built the community, we built awareness, and people have donated to the cause. That's great. So major thanks there. But also the people who got involved to support the foundation. As I mentioned, Sue, Danielle, Kristen, Carmen, Chris, yourself, just so being there. I met with Danielle and Sue every week to talk about the ride, how we're doing, what more we could do, how to get the messaging right, how to set up the back end website. They were incredibly supportive. And I really appreciated that support. I added in work to their day-to-day jobs and they gladly took it on. So just incredible thanks and gratitude to them. Incredible gratitude to the research universities. These PhDs and MDs are really busy. They carved out time to show us the labs, to talk about their research, to meet with us and hear our stories. I can't be more grateful to them. I had incredible friend support. People opened their homes for fundraisers. I had friends who joined us on the road to help drive the RV and keep us company while we were there. People who were tremendous donors who wrote those first big checks to kind of get the momentum going. So incredibly thankful for them. We had some great sponsors, Rich Kellner at PKD, Emily and Justin Strauss, they mentioned at the EF Collection, Rich Marks at 28 Freight, Sean Ostoff, who's the president and CEO of the Bank of Colorado, David Crowd, who's the chairman at Milkbox Partners, Regulus Therapeutics. They all donated and sponsored significantly without really asking for much other than to be connected to it. And by the way, that connection with PKD and with the EF Collection, I think will bear fruit for many, many years to come for the foundation. So I think those are really good connections to have. We had a lot of volunteers and interns who helped us with logistics and planning and all of the events that were in the field. So I'm very grateful to them for joining the team. And then lastly, there's a saying, behind every great man is an even greater woman. I have two even greater women in my life. My sister, Amy, who runs a public relations firm called Reamer Communications. She's been with me every step of the way and has really done it as a labor of love to not only support her big brother. And by the way, she doesn't have PKD, so it isn't like it affects her or her family beyond myself, but she just accepted it as her own challenge. And public relations and marketing and the events, the silent auctions. I mean, she drove all of that and did it, with such great professionalism and love in her heart. I'm just a very, very lucky brother to have. I have two loving sisters, but Amy was the one who was very actively involved. So that's great woman, greater woman, number one. Greater woman, number two, is really the most valuable player of the ride. I know I made these comments in Kansas City, but Beth was an absolute superstar. She handled, I rode my bike. She handled everything else on the road, everything else. The RV, the logistics, the campgrounds, shopping, entertaining, everything. Even to the point where my slippers were outside the RV when I got back to the RV in the afternoon, so I could get my cycling shoes off and get to the showers. She kept me healthy. She kept me fed. She took care of, as I said, everything. And the interesting thing is, when I started the ride, she would refer to it as my ride. Right? Hey, Glenn, what are you going to do for your ride? And by the middle of the ride, she was referring to it as our ride. And now when we talk about next steps, she says, what are we going to do next? And so she really did sort of the power of the community and the passion that I have for this infected her, if you will. And now she's 100% on board, which is just very gratifying. So, but major kudos to Beth. I literally couldn't have done it without her. And she really was the MVP of the ride. So I'm just, my heart's filled with gratitude. I'm just so lucky to be who I am with the friends and family and support network that I have. Just incredible. I don't feel alone in this journey, and that's a great feeling.